The young girl was left tied to the wolves, abandoned to a fate no child should ever face. The mountain man, a solitary figure known only to the wilderness, discovered her in that moment between life and death. He saved her when the world had turned its back, creating a bond that would defy the cruelty that brought them together. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The moon shone cold and white over the Appalachian Ridge, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted pines. John Smith moved with the practiced silence of a man who had made these mountains his home for years. The reclusive mountain man of Hollow Creek knew every trail and hollow of this wilderness better than the lines on his weathered palms. The night air carried the familiar distant snarls of wolves. Nothing unusual in these parts. John pulled his fur-lined coat tighter against the biting wind, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He had planned a simple night check of his traps, but then it came. A sound that stopped him mid-stride. A desperate, piercing cry echoed through the trees, bouncing off the ridge and settling like ice in John's veins. His heart clenched painfully in his chest. This was no animal. This was human, young and terrified. Ancient warnings flickered through his mind like dying embers. The elders of Hollow Creek had their rituals, their traditions that no one questioned. The mountain demands sacrifice, they would mutter during the long winter nights. The wolves must be appeased. Tales he'd dismissed as superstition now took on a horrifying new meaning. Ignoring the sting of snow against his face, John crept closer to the source of the sound, his hunting knife clutched tightly in his gloved hand. The moonlight illuminated his path in patches between the trees, guiding him toward a clearing at the forest's edge. What he saw there froze his blood colder than the winter night. A young girl stood tied fast to a wooden stake driven deep into the frozen ground. Her dark hair whipped wildly in the wind, her face a mask of pure terror. Mary Johnson. He recognized her from the few times he'd ventured into the village for supplies. She couldn't be more than 13 years old. Around her, a pack of wolves circled with predatory patience, their fire-bright eyes reflecting the moonlight as they prowled. 7, maybe 8 of them, moving with hungry purpose. The largest, an alpha with silver-tipped fur, snapped its jaws, testing the girl's resolve with each approach. Her body was rigid with fear, her wrists raw and bleeding from struggling against the cruel ropes that bound her. Someone had left her here deliberately, tied her securely and abandoned her to the wilderness. This was no accident. This was ritual. John's fingers tightened around his knife. The village elders, particularly Robert Brown, had always regarded him with suspicion. Now he understood why. He was an outsider who might question their ways, their sacrifices. The girl's eyes, wide with terror and glistening with tears, suddenly locked with his across the clearing, a silent plea that struck him deeper than any knife could reach. The villagers of Hollow Creek stood at the edge of the forest, their faces half hidden beneath woolen scarves and the long shadows of dusk. Not one of them stepped forward into the moonlit clearing where the girl struggled against her bonds. Their stillness wasn't from lack of compassion, but from something deeper, a bone-deep adherence to tradition that had governed their isolated community for generations. Elder Robert Brown stood at the front, his weathered face impassive as stone. "The ritual must be completed," he murmured, and those around him nodded solemnly. These ceremonies weren't spoken of in daylight hours. They existed in whispers, in knowing glances, in the collective memory of a village that believed survival depended on ancient pacts with the wilderness. When someone disappeared from Hollow Creek, questions weren't asked. Children were taught early that some sacrifices were necessary, that the wolves demanded tribute, that the mountains had appetites that must be satisfied. Those who challenged this wisdom found themselves ostracized or worse. John Smith watched from the tree line, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Unlike the others, He knew the bitter taste of exile. 5 winters ago, he'd questioned the elders publicly, challenging their interpretation of signs that had condemned a sickly infant. For his defiance, they'd driven him to the ridge where he'd built his solitary life. The memory of that banishment burned in his chest as he watched the girl struggle. Her face, young and terrified, reflected the approaching wolf's eyes, amber pinpricks in the darkness that multiplied as the pack sensed vulnerability. "This isn't right," John whispered to himself, his hand gripping the rough bark of a pine. The girl's muffled cries carried across the clearing, slicing through his hesitation. Without conscious thought, John's body surged forward. He grabbed a fallen branch, thrust its end into a nearby ritual fire, and charged toward the stake. His muscles screamed with exertion as he swung the blazing wood in wide arcs, driving back the closest wolves. They retreated with snarls and snapping jaws, circling just beyond the fire's reach. The mountain man worked frantically at the girl's bonds, his trembling fingers fighting against the intricate knots. He noticed strange marks on the ropes, deliberate cuts that would have hastened their breaking, ensuring the wolves would reach her more quickly. Someone had wanted this ritual to be especially cruel. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough from disuse as the final rope gave way. Behind him, gasps and angry murmurs rose from the villagers. John knew what this meant. By interfering with the ritual, he had challenged not just Elder Brown's authority, but the very foundation of Hollow Creek's beliefs. The girl collapsed against him, sobbing, as he lifted her into his arms. Meeting the elder's furious gaze across the clearing, John understood that nothing would ever be the same. This single act of mercy would upend everything, for himself, for the girl, and for the entire valley. Mary Johnson collapsed into John's arms, her small frame racked with sobs that disappeared into the thick fur of his weathered coat. Her fingers clutched desperately at the rough material, as if afraid he might vanish. John Smith could feel her entire body trembling against his chest, a shivering that came not just from the biting mountain cold, but from a terror that had sunk deep into her bones during those hours tied to the stake. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. The young girl didn't respond, only pressed her tear-streaked face harder against him. The wolves lingered at the edge of the clearing, their hungry eyes reflecting the moonlight. They kept their distance, but refused to retreat entirely. John knew better than to turn his back on them. The mountain man shifted Mary's weight in his arms and began the long trek back to his cabin on the ridge. Each step through the bitter snow was deliberate and careful. His boots crunched over the frozen earth, breaking the silence of the Appalachian night. The only other sounds were Mary's occasional whimpers and their hearts pounding in tandem. His steady and determined, hers racing with lingering fear. "Why?" she finally managed between chattering teeth. "Why did they do this to me?" John had no answer that would comfort a child. The traditions of Hollow Creek were as old as the mountains themselves. But never had he imagined they would sacrifice someone so young. He tightened his grip protectively around her shoulders. "It doesn't matter now," he said, though he knew it mattered deeply. The elders would be furious. Elder Robert Brown would likely lead the charge against him when word spread of what he'd done. Behind them, the eyes of the wolf pack glowed with something that felt almost like accusation. These were not merely hungry beasts. They were witnesses to generations of Hollow Creek's darkest rituals. John couldn't shake the feeling that, in their amber stares, was a judgment that extended beyond this night, as if they recognized his interference in something ancient and terrible. The cold wind cut through his layers as he trudged upward toward his isolated home. Mary's breathing had steadied somewhat, though she flinched at every distant howl. Her ordeal had only just begun. Saving her from the wolves was one thing. Protecting her from the village would be another challenge entirely. "I won't let them take you back," he promised, surprising himself with the fierce certainty in his voice. After years of solitude, The mountain man had found something worth fighting for in this broken ritual and the trembling child in his arms. The night deepened around them as they climbed higher, leaving behind the accusatory eyes of the pack and moving toward an uncertain dawn. By dawn, Hollow Creek buzzed with outrage. Word of John Smith's interference with the ritual had spread through the village like wildfire. Residents gathered in clusters, their hushed whispers creating a nervous hum that filled the morning air. The village square, normally peaceful at this hour, now teemed with agitated villagers demanding answers. The Council of Elders convened beneath the ancient oak that had witnessed generations of Hollow Creek traditions. Their weathered faces were etched with concern as they debated what this breach of sacred custom might mean for their community. Some pounded fists against wooden benches, while others gestured wildly toward the mountains. "This is blasphemy." Elder Robert Brown's voice cracked with emotion as he addressed the gathering. The elderly man's hands trembled, not from age, but from conviction. "For 10 generations, we have maintained order through sacred covenant. Smith has defied our most hallowed right and risked bringing chaos upon us all." Several villagers nodded in agreement, clutching protective charms that hung around their necks. A woman near the back called out, "The wolves will come for us now. Our children won't be safe." Bram Davis pushed his way through the crowd, his blacksmith's frame imposing as he joined the elders. "I say we retrieve the girl and restore what was broken," he announced, receiving murmurs of approval from those most deeply entrenched in tradition. Meanwhile, John made his way along the ridge path, his body aching from the night's exertion. Mary Johnson lay cradled in his arms, her slight form wrapped in his outer garment for warmth. The young girl's eyes remained half-closed, exhaustion and trauma evident in her pale face. "They'll come for you," she whispered, her first words since her rescue. "Let them try," he responded, his voice low but resolute. When 3 village men appeared on the path ahead, John tightened his grip on Mary. The confrontation was brief but tense, the mountain man's reputation for fierce independence giving the men pause. "Brown says she belongs to the ritual," one stated flatly. John fixed him with a steely gaze. "She belongs to herself." Without another word, he continued past them, his stride purposeful despite his fatigue. The cabin appeared through the morning mist, a humble structure of timber and stone that had been his solitary refuge for years. Now it would be sanctuary for 2. Inside, he gently laid Mary on his bed of furs, stoking the embers in the hearth to bring warmth back to the dwelling. As flames flickered to life, John stood at the window, watching the path from the village. He knew this defiance would not go unanswered, but after years of exile, he had nothing left to lose, except perhaps the fragile trust forming between himself and the child he had saved from an unthinkable fate. Inside the cabin, Mary Johnson lay wrapped in thick layers of animal pelts, her small frame almost disappearing beneath the weight of fur. The mountain refuge smelled of pine, leather, and the lingering scent of yesterday's stew. Firelight danced across the rough-hewn walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The young girl's eyes reflected the flames as she stared into them, finding patterns in the orange and yellow tongues that licked at blackened logs. "They chose me 3 days ago," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. John leaned forward on his wooden stool, straining to hear her words. "Elder Brown said I had been marked by the spirits." The mountain man's weathered hands tightened around his mug of hot tea. He said nothing, giving her space to continue. "But that wasn't true," she continued, pulling the pelts closer. "I refused to dance at the winter blessing. I told them I didn't believe in the old ways." A bitter smile crossed her pale face. "My father wouldn't look at me after that. Mother cried, but she didn't stop them when they came." John's jaw clenched, the muscles working beneath his beard. He'd seen this before. the way Hollow Creek maintained order through fear disguised as tradition. 15 years ago, he'd questioned the elders about a similar ritual. His reward had been banishment, forced to make his home in the wilderness while the village pretended he'd never existed. They said the wolves would only take the unworthy, Mary continued, her fingers tracing patterns in the fur. That if I was pure of heart, the pack would spare me. She looked up at John, her eyes suddenly sharp with anger. But they tied the rope so tight I couldn't even move my hands. How was I supposed to prove anything? A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks spiraling upward. Outside, the wind howled, not unlike the wolves that had circled her hours before. You weren't, John said finally, his voice rough from disuse. That's the secret they don't tell. No one survives the ritual, not because the wolves are judges, but because no one can escape those ropes. Mary nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You knew. That's why you came. The cabin fell silent except for the popping of the fire. John rose and added another log, watching the flames leap higher. I knew, he confirmed, turning back to face her. And now you know too. The dance, the rituals, they're not about protection. They're about obedience. Mary's fingers curled into fists beneath the pelts. What happens now? John Smith looked toward the window, where the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. Now, he said quietly, we survive. The first tender shoots of green pushed through the melting snow, heralding spring's arrival to Hollow Creek. With the changing season came the village's ancient tradition of the purging fires. Massive bonfires built at strategic points around the settlement. John Smith observed from the safety of the tree line as villagers gathered, their faces transformed by the dancing orange flames into masks of worry and doubt. The wolves have been restless since the ritual was broken, Elder Robert Brown announced, his weathered hands gesturing dramatically toward the distant mountains. We must cleanse ourselves of the disruption or face their wrath. The assembled crowd murmured anxiously, casting furtive glances toward John's cabin on the ridge. Some nodded in agreement with the elder's warnings, while others remained silent, uncertainty etched across their features. Bram Davis stood prominently at Brown's side, his muscular frame tensed as he fed the flames with additional logs. Mary Johnson was chosen for a reason, the blacksmith called out, sparks flying upward as he spoke. The mountain man has doomed us all. Back at the cabin, John focused on teaching Mary the skills she would need to survive. He demonstrated how to fashion a simple snare from twine and twigs, his calloused hands moving with practiced precision. Like this? Mary asked, her nimble fingers replicating his work with surprising accuracy. Exactly right, he nodded, a rare smile softening his weathered features. You're learning faster than I did. The girl beamed with pride. Each day brought new lessons, how to strike flint to create fire, which plants could heal and which would harm, how to read animal tracks pressed into soft earth. She absorbed everything with fierce determination, her eyes growing sharper, her movements more confident. The woods speak their own language, John explained one evening, as they sat beside a small fire outside the cabin. Every broken twig, every disturbed patch of ground tells a story. Mary listened intently, no longer the terrified child he'd cut from the stake. Her nightmares still came, but less frequently now. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, John caught her staring toward the village with a complex mixture of longing and fear. Do you miss it? He asked quietly. She considered his question, pulling her knees to her chest. I miss what it should have been, she finally answered. Not what it was. As the weeks passed, their routine created an unexpected bond. The cabin, once a lonely refuge for a solitary outcast, gradually transformed into something John had never expected to find in his exile, a home. And with each lesson mastered, Mary moved further from the shadows of her past and closer to the heart of the man who had saved her. The gray dawn was breaking over the ridge when Mary Johnson first noticed the wolf cub. Small and hesitant, with eyes like polished river stones, it lingered at the edge of the clearing while John taught her how to identify edible mushrooms. The mountain man tensed when he spotted the creature, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. "Don't move," he whispered. But Mary was already turning, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's just a baby," she said, her voice barely audible. The cub tilted its head, ears perked forward with curiosity rather than aggression. Over the following days, the young wolf returned, each time venturing a little closer. John remained vigilant, watching from the porch of his cabin as Mary began leaving small scraps of meat at increasing distances from the tree line. His weathered face betrayed both concern and fascination as the girl who had once been bound for sacrifice now extended her hand to the wild. "The pack might follow," he cautioned one evening as they sat before the fire. "Wolves, don't forget." Mary nodded, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the hearth ash. "Neither do I," she replied, and something in her tone made John fall silent. By the third week, the cub would take food directly from her palm, its wet nose brushing against her fingers. Mary named it Shadow for the way it followed her movements, always maintaining a respectful distance until called forward. The bond between them grew with each passing day. Strengthening like the spring saplings pushing through the thawing earth, word spread quickly through Hollow Creek. Sarah Miller, who gathered herbs near John's property, was the first to spot them together. By sundown, the village buzzed with fearful speculation. "The child communes with beasts," Elder Robert Brown declared at the meeting hall, his voice carrying the weight of ancient warnings. "This is what comes of defying our ways." Bram Davis pounded his fist against the wall. "First she escapes judgment. Now she brings the wolves closer. We should drive them both beyond the ridge before worse follows." Others whispered that Mary possessed unnatural powers, that she had been marked by the ritual, transformed by her night among the wolves. Some claimed to have seen her whispering to Shadow in a language no human should know. Only healer Jennifer Smith dared suggest another possibility. "Perhaps," she offered quietly, "the girl simply shows kindness where we showed none." Back at the cabin, unaware of the growing tension, Mary sat cross-legged in the yard with Shadow curled beside her. John watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable as the unlikely pair dozed in the afternoon sun. The once terrified girl and the creature whose kind had nearly been her end, now bound by something neither village nor wilderness could fully understand. The solstice market transformed Hollow Creek's village square into a vibrant tapestry of color and commerce. Wooden stalls lined the perimeter, heavy with summer's bounty, jars of golden honey catching sunlight, bundles of herbs hanging in fragrant clusters, and woven baskets overflowing with freshly shorn wool. Children darted between adults, their laughter mingling with the steady hum of bartering and gossip. John Smith arrived late, his gait slightly uneven from a wound sustained while tracking deer 3 days prior. The injury wasn't severe, but the jagged cut along his thigh pulled with each step. He kept his face impassive, nodding curtly to those villagers brave enough to acknowledge him. Mary followed several paces behind, her eyes wide as she absorbed the market's energy. The wolf cub remained at their cabin, a concession John had insisted upon to avoid further provocation. She carried a small bundle of pelts he'd prepared for trade, her slender fingers gripping the leather ties tightly. "There he is," a voice boomed across the square. "The man who thinks he knows better than our ancestors." The crowd parted as Bram Davis stepped forward. The blacksmith's massive frame cast a long shadow, his forearms corded with muscle from years at the forge. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the early hour. "You've brought a curse upon us all, Smith," Bram continued, jabbing a thick finger toward John. "That girl was chosen for a reason. The spirits demand balance." A murmur rippled through the gathering. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the two men. John's jaw tightened. "The only curse in this valley is blind obedience to cruelty," he replied, voice low, but carrying across the sudden silence. The wound in his thigh throbbed as he straightened to his full height. "You mock our ways." Bram's face flushed crimson. "My grandfather saw what happens when the ritual is broken. Crops fail, children sicken, the wolves grow bold." Elder Robert Brown stood at the edge of the confrontation, his weathered face unreadable as he observed the exchange. The old man's silence carried more weight than any intervention. "I've lived in these mountains longer than most," John said, meeting Bram's glare without. Mary Johnson stood at the edge of the market square, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against her like a physical force. Mothers pulled their children closer as she passed, and conversations hushed to whispers. The wolf cub, now the size of a small dog, pressed against her leg, its gray eyes alert and watchful. Despite the scrutiny, Mary lifted her chin and straightened her spine, refusing to shrink beneath their collective suspicion. "That's the cursed girl," someone muttered just loudly enough for her to hear. "The one who should have been given to the wolves." The young girl's fingers trembled slightly, but she continued walking through the market, pretending to examine the jars of honey and bundles of herbs. The cub growled softly whenever someone approached too closely, earning fearful glances and hurried steps away. From across the square, she caught sight of the confrontation between John and Bram Davis. The blacksmith's booming voice carried across the crowd, his accusations hanging in the air like storm clouds. Mary's heart pounded as she watched John stand his ground despite the fresh wound from his hunting accident. His face remained impassive, but she could see the pain in his eyes, not just physical, but the deeper hurt of being forever marked as different. Later that evening, John's eyes followed her movements, surprise evident in his expression. "I can manage. You saved my life," she replied simply. "Now be still." The mountain man submitted with reluctance, his weathered hands gripping the chair arms as Mary cleaned the wound. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire and their measured breathing. Outside, night creatures began their chorus, and somewhere in the distance, wolves called to one another. As she worked, John studied her face in the flickering light, the determined set of her jaw, the careful precision of her movements. This was not the same frightened girl he'd cut from the stake months ago. Something had changed in her, hardened and strengthened. "You did well today," he said finally, standing tall like that. Mary's hands paused briefly. "I learned from you." A comfortable silence settled between them as she finished bandaging his wound. The roles had shifted, protector becoming protected, teacher becoming student. In that quiet moment, something unspoken passed between them, a trust deeper than words could express. The wolf cub curled at Mary's feet, watching them both with intelligent eyes, a living bridge between two worlds that neither fully belonged to anymore. The hills surrounding Hollow Creek blazed with autumn's fiery palette as villagers gathered for the grain blessing. This ancient ceremony marked the transition between harvest and winter's approach, when fields were circled with chanting to ensure next year's bounty. Mary Johnson watched from a distance, the small gray wolf cub pressed against her leg, its intelligent eyes taking in the gathering crowd. After months under John Smith's protection, Mary had grown bolder. The reclusive mountain man stood nearby, his weathered face betraying concern as she whispered her intention. "They need to see him as I do," she insisted, stroking the cub's fur, "not as something to fear." John frowned. "The village isn't ready," he cautioned, but recognized the determination in her eyes, the same defiance that had marked her for sacrifice months ago. As villagers arranged grain offerings around the wooden altar, Mary approached with deliberate steps, the wolf cub trotting beside her. A hush fell over the gathering. She placed a small bundle of wild herbs beside the other offerings and gently guided her companion to sit nearby. "What blasphemy is this?" Elder Robert Brown's voice cracked through the silence. The elderly man pushed through the crowd, his face contorted with outrage. "You bring a beast to our sacred blessing?" "He's not a beast," Mary answered, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "He's part of the valley too." The elder's staff struck the ground. "Your presence alone taints our ceremony. This," he gestured toward the cub, "mocks everything we believe." Bram Davis stepped forward, the blacksmith's massive frame towering over Mary. "The girl thinks she can rewrite our ways," he growled. "First she survives the ritual, now she brings wolves to our altar." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some villagers backed away, clutching protective charms. Others glared with open hostility. The chanting that had begun earlier faltered and died. But not everyone recoiled. 3 children edged closer, eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. A small girl with braided hair whispered, "It's not attacking. Look how calm it is." As if understanding its role, the wolf cub remained perfectly still beside Mary, neither growling nor retreating. Wind gusted suddenly across the clearing, sending crimson and gold leaves spiraling around the altar. Mary stood her ground, chin raised despite the weight of accusation. In that moment, with autumn light catching in her hair, she embodied something the village had forgotten: that courage often appears dangerous to those who've chosen safety through fear. "The spirits will punish this defiance," Elder Brown declared, but his words carried less conviction than before. John moved quietly to Mary's side, his presence a silent affirmation. Together they faced the village, defenders of a new understanding that threatened generations of tradition, yet promised something far more valuable than blind obedience. Thunder crashed against the mountains as rain lashed down upon Hollow Creek with unnatural fury. The storm had descended without warning, black clouds swallowing the harvest moon and unleashing their wrath upon the vulnerable village. John Smith stood at his cabin window, watching lightning illuminate the valley in harsh white flashes. By dawn, the devastation was clear. The old granary, the village's lifeline through winter, had collapsed under the onslaught, its wooden beams splintered like matchsticks. Precious grain lay scattered and sodden, much of it beyond salvage. "The spirits are angry," Elder Robert Brown declared, his weathered face tight with accusation as villagers gathered around the ruins. "We broke the sacred cycle when we allowed the girl to live." His gaze fell heavily on Mary Johnson, who stood beside John, her wolf cub pressed against her leg. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "The mountain man brought this upon us," muttered Bram Davis, his blacksmith hands clenched into fists. "His defiance will starve us all before spring." Mary flinched at their words, but kept her chin raised. The young survivor had grown stronger since her rescue, yet John could see how each accusation cut her. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her small frame. "Storms have come before," John countered, his voice carrying across the murmuring crowd. "And they'll come again long after we're gone." But he knew their fear wasn't baseless. Without the granary stores, Hollow Creek faced a brutal winter. Already mothers clutched their children closer, calculating how to stretch dwindling supplies through the coming months. That evening, John returned to his cabin to find Mary sitting cross-legged before the fireplace, absently stroking the wolf cub's fur. "They hate me," she whispered, not looking up. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should have—" "Don't," he interrupted sharply. "Don't ever think that." The mountain man kenneled beside her, his rugged features softened by the firelight. "People have always blamed what they don't understand. I've carried their suspicion for years." He stoked the fire, watching sparks rise. "This storm is just the beginning. Winter's coming, and with it, real hunger." Mary's eyes met his, understanding dawning. "They'll blame us more when their children cry for food." John nodded grimly. The recluse had survived many winters alone, but never had he felt such weight of responsibility. The true test wouldn't be weathering the villagers' suspicion. It would be proving their worth when hunger gnawed at Hollow Creek's resolve. Then we'll have to show them another way, he said quietly, a plan already forming in his mind. The snow came down in thick, relentless sheets, burying Hollow Creek beneath a white shroud. Food stores dwindled dangerously after the storm had destroyed the granary. John Smith watched from his cabin window as villagers trudged through knee-deep drifts, their faces gaunt with growing hunger. "We have to help them," Mary Johnson whispered, her wolf cub curled at her feet. "Even those who wanted me gone." John nodded, his weathered face set with determination. By dawn, they had packed what meager supplies they could spare: dry jerky, 2 knives, and a length of rope. The mountain man knew of hunting grounds beyond the northern ridge, where deer sometimes gathered in winter. It was their only hope. The journey was brutal. Wind cut through their layers of fur and wool as they pushed forward, each step a battle against nature's fury. Mary's cheeks burned red with cold, but she never complained, matching John's pace with fierce determination. The howls of wolves echoed across the valley, sending shivers down their spines that had nothing to do with the temperature. "They're hunting too," John explained, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Just like us." By midday, they reached the hunting grounds, fingers numb and legs trembling with exhaustion. John taught Mary to move silently despite the snow, to read tracks nearly obscured by fresh powder. Together, they set snares in strategic locations, the young girl proving herself a quick study. "My father used to hunt," she confided, before Elder Brown convinced him the old ways were better. Their patience was rewarded when they spotted a small herd of deer sheltering in a grove of pines. John's aim was true, bringing down 2 animals with clean shots. Mary helped him dress the carcasses, her hands steady despite never having performed such work before. The return journey proved even more treacherous. Darkness fell early, and the weight of their bounty slowed their progress. Twice they heard wolves closing in, forcing them to light branches as makeshift torches to keep the pack at bay. When they finally stumbled into Hollow Creek, their faces were frostbitten, their limbs nearly frozen. But the deer meat they carried would feed the village for weeks. Bram Davis was the first to approach, wordlessly helping to distribute the food. Even Elder Robert Brown could not hide his relief, though his pride prevented him from thanking the outcasts directly. Healer Jennifer Smith tended to their frostbite, whispering, "What you've done today speaks louder than any ritual." That night, as villagers ate their first proper meal in days, something shifted in Hollow Creek. The 2 people they had cast aside had risked everything to save them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first fragile bridge across a chasm of fear and tradition. The harshest days of winter descended upon Hollow Creek like a shroud. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and temperatures plummeted until breath crystallized in the air. With this deepening cold came the annual vigil, a tradition as old as the settlement itself. Villagers lined the ridge with flickering lanterns, their golden glow forming a fragile barrier against what the elders called shadow beasts, creatures said to hunt during the longest nights of winter. Elder Robert Brown supervised the placement of each light, his weathered hands trembling not just from cold, but from the weight of responsibility. "The lanterns must burn until dawn," he instructed, voice carrying on the bitter wind. "Our ancestors knew the price of darkness." Fear hung thick in the air, almost tangible as the smoke rising from chimneys. Neighbors peered anxiously from behind shuttered windows, clutching worn charms carved from bone and wood. Children were hushed, fires stoked high, prayers whispered into the gathering gloom. John Smith watched from his cabin, skepticism etched across his face. Yet even he couldn't deny the unnatural silence that fell as night deepened. Mary Johnson stood beside him, her young face solemn in the firelight. "They're afraid," she whispered, "but not of what they should be." As midnight approached, a bitter wind swept down from the mountains, extinguishing lanterns one by one. Panic shouts echoed across the valley as villagers rushed to relight them, but the flames flickered dangerously low against the strengthening gale. Then came the howls, first one, then many. Wolves gathered beyond the last glow of light. The village braced for disaster. Doors barricaded, weapons readied. But it was Mary who stepped forward, slipping past John's protective grasp. She walked steadily toward the edge of light, her small figure silhouetted against the snow. "Mary!" John called, rushing after her. But the girl raised her hand, stopping him. Then, to the horror and amazement of all watching, she began to sing, a wordless melody that rose and fell like the wind itself. Her voice, clear and unafraid, wove with the low howls until a strange harmony settled over the snowbound night. The wolves ceased their advance. They sat, watching, as if listening to a language long forgotten by humans, but remembered in their wild blood. Healer Jennifer Smith clutched her shawl tighter, whispering, "The child speaks to them." Slowly, impossibly, the lanterns steadied, their flames growing stronger despite the wind. And as dawn finally broke over the ridge, not a single shadow beast had crossed the line of light. John Smith stood frozen at the edge of the gathering, his weathered hands clenched into fists as he watched Mary step toward the approaching wolves. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, his heart hammering against his ribs. The villagers had fallen silent, their lanterns trembling in white-knuckled grips as the pack emerged from the darkness. But Mary Johnson showed no fear. Her slight frame, silhouetted against the snow, remained steady as she began to sing, a melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The song had no words, just pure, unwavering notes that carried across the ridge and mingled with the wolves' howls until they became one voice. The mountain man had seen many things in his years of isolation, but nothing like this. The largest wolf, silver-backed and scarred, approached Mary with measured steps. The villagers gasped collectively, several women turning away, unable to watch. But instead of attacking, the creature lowered its massive head, ears flattening in what looked remarkably like submission. "She's speaking their language," whispered Healer Jennifer from beside John, her voice filled with awe. This is what the ritual was meant to be, before fear corrupted it. The other wolves followed their leader's example, forming a circle around the girl, but keeping a respectful distance. Mary continued her haunting melody, her hand outstretched but not touching the animals. Her wolf cub, now grown larger, moved between the pack and the humans like a bridge between worlds. Elder Robert Brown's face contorted with confusion. The old man's authority had always rested on his knowledge of tradition, on the certainty that only sacrifice could keep the village safe. Now, as the wolves settled peacefully at the boundary of their light, that certainty crumbled visibly. "The ritual was meant to find strength," John said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "not to destroy it." Villagers who had once crossed the street to avoid Mary now watched with newfound respect. Bram Davis, the burly blacksmith who had been among John's harshest critics, slowly lowered his weapon. "All these years," he muttered, "we thought we were appeasing the darkness." When Mary's song finally ended, the wolves retreated, not in fear, but with dignified purpose, melting back into the forest like ghosts. The girl turned to face the village, her eyes bright with tears, but her posture unbowed. In that moment, John saw what the others were beginning to understand, that the strength to face darkness came not from cruelty or fear, but from the courage to stand between worlds with compassion. Elder Brown's gaze met his across the crowd, and for the first time, the old man looked uncertain of his path. The thaw brought more than melting snow to Hollow Creek. As John Smith examined the frayed ropes that had once bound Mary to that terrible stake, his calloused fingers traced over peculiar gouges in the hemp. These weren't the random tears of wolf teeth, but deliberate cuts, too precise, too calculated. "Someone wanted to make sure you couldn't break free," he muttered, turning the rope in his hands. These marks were made before the wolves ever came. Mary shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. The memory of that night still haunted her dreams, but this revelation carried a different kind of horror. "Someone from the village?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded grimly. The mountain man had suspected the ritual wasn't as ancient or sacred as the elders claimed, but this was evidence of malice beyond tradition. Someone had wanted Mary to suffer, or worse, to disappear without trace. That evening, a hesitant knock interrupted their meal. Healer Jennifer Smith stood at the threshold, her normally confident posture bent with the weight of unspoken words. John invited her inside, noting how her eyes darted nervously to the corners of the cabin. "I can't stay silent anymore," Jennifer began, accepting a steaming cup with trembling hands. "Before they chose you, Mary, I spoke against it. Your name wasn't drawn by chance." The healer's confession spilled forth like a dam breaking. She had warned the council that Mary was too young, that the ritual had become unnecessarily cruel over generations. But Elder Brown had silenced her with a single cold stare. "They needed someone who would serve as an example," Jennifer explained, tears gathering in her eyes. "Someone who had questioned the old ways. Your refusal to participate in last autumn's dance marked you." Mary's face paled as understanding dawned. "They wanted to punish me for asking questions." The ritual was once symbolic, a test of courage with the community watching over the chosen one, Jennifer continued. But over time, some began to believe real sacrifice was necessary to appease the mountain spirits. John's fist came down hard on the wooden table. Sacrifice? They were willing to let a child die for their superstitions? Jennifer couldn't meet his gaze. "Not all of them. Some truly believe the ritual protects us. Others," her voice trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. As the healer departed, John watched Mary stroke the wolf cub that had become her constant companion. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very creatures meant to be her doom had become allies, while those who should have protected her had engineered her suffering. "We need to know who cut those ropes," John said finally, "and why Elder Brown was so determined to silence anyone who questioned the ritual." Mary nodded, a new determination hardening in her eyes. "The truth won't stay buried in the snow forever." John Smith paced the wooden floor of his cabin, his mind racing with the fragments of truth he had gathered. The ritual that had nearly claimed Mary Johnson's life was not what the villagers believed. Ancient texts borrowed from Jennifer's collection revealed a different story. What began as a symbolic offering of food and clothing to appease the mountain spirits had transformed over generations into something monstrous. "They changed it," he muttered to Mary, who sat quietly by the fire. "The elders twisted the ritual to control the village through fear." Mary nodded, her fingers absently stroking the wolf cub curled beside her. "I questioned too many things," she said softly. "Asked why we couldn't trade with the next valley, why women couldn't speak at council." John's jaw tightened. The healer's confession echoed in his mind, how Jennifer had warned Elder Brown that choosing Mary was wrong, that the ritual had become corrupted. The claw marks on the ropes weren't from wolves, but made deliberately to ensure Mary wouldn't escape before the pack arrived. "You were never meant to survive," he said, his voice thick with rage. "You were a lesson to anyone who might challenge them." The mountain man gathered his resolve like a physical thing, wrapping himself in determination as surely as he donned his heavy coat. Mary watched him with knowing eyes. "What will you do?" she asked. "What should have been done years ago?" The council meeting that evening was packed with villagers seeking guidance after the harsh winter. John pushed through the crowd, ignoring the whispers that followed him. Elder Brown sat elevated on his carved chair, flanked by the other elders whose faces showed varying degrees of discomfort as the outsider approached. "You've no place here, Smith," Brown declared, his authority seeming to shrink in the face of John's quiet fury. "I've earned my place," John replied, his voice carrying through the hall, "by saving what you tried to destroy, by feeding those you would have let starve." He produced the ancient text, its pages yellowed with age. "This is your ritual, the true one. Not sacrifice, but symbolic offering. You twisted it to silence those who questioned you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Bram Davis stepped forward menacingly, but several villagers blocked his path, their expressions uncertain but resolute. "We survived because we followed tradition," Elder Brown insisted, though his voice wavered. "No," John countered. "You survived because people like Mary had the courage to think beyond your fears. Because some of us refused to let cruelty masquerade as wisdom." The weight of exile hung in John's words. Years of solitude that had taught him the difference between tradition that protected and tradition that imprisoned. His compassion, hard-won through suffering, gave his challenge a power that mere anger could never match. The council chamber fell silent. The future of Hollow Creek balanced on the edge of a blade. Elias Johnson's wagon creaked through the muddy outskirts of Hollow Creek, his pockets heavier with each stop. The traveling peddler had discovered that fear sold better than any trinket in his collection. With calculated whispers at neighboring settlements, he painted Mary as a witch who commanded wolves and brought storms upon those who crossed her. "The girl should have been sacrificed," he told wide-eyed traders from Pine Ridge. "Now the mountain spirits are angry. Trade with Hollow Creek at your peril." Word traveled back to the village faster than spring floods. Merchants who had always exchanged goods with Hollow Creek suddenly found excuses to delay their visits. The few who braved the journey demanded higher prices, claiming risk to their safety. John confronted the peddler outside the village store, his weathered face tight with barely contained fury. "You're destroying livelihoods for coin," he growled, towering over Elias. "These people struggle enough without your lies." The peddler merely smiled, adjusting his worn cap. "I merely report what I observe. The girl lives with wolves. The storms came after her rescue. The people deserve to know." Mary watched from across the square, the wolf cub pressed against her leg. She felt the familiar weight of stares, but refused to lower her gaze. 3 months ago, she would have hidden away. But John had taught her that courage wasn't about feeling no fear. It was about standing tall despite it. That evening, as traders from Riverdale prepared to depart early, Mary approached them directly. The wolf cub padded silently beside her, no longer the frightened creature of winter, but a sleek, confident companion. "The stories you've heard are meant to frighten," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I was chosen for sacrifice because I questioned cruelty disguised as tradition. The wolves never wanted my blood. They recognized something the village had forgotten." John joined her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Hollow Creek is changing," he added, "not through curses, but through choice. Judge us by what you see, not by tales spun for profit." Their directness caught the attention of villagers who had been avoiding them. Even Bram Davis, still wary but no longer openly hostile, stepped forward to confirm their goods were sound. One by one, neighbors who had benefited from John and Mary's winter hunt added their voices. By nightfall, what had begun as 2 outcasts defending themselves had transformed into something unexpected. A community finding its voice against both outside manipulation and internal fear. The alliance was uneasy, fragile as spring ice, but it was real. Elias Johnson departed the next morning, his wagon lighter than when he'd arrived. His tales had lost their power when faced with the simple truth. The girl who had been left for wolves now stood among them, unbroken. The final days of winter brought a subtle shift to John Smith's cabin. As the snow outside began to recede, revealing patches of damp earth beneath, something else was thawing inside the rough-hewn walls. The mountain man watched as Mary combed through her hair before the crackling fire, her movements more confident than when he'd first carried her, trembling, across the threshold. "Let me try," John offered, his calloused hands hovering uncertainly near her dark strands. Mary smiled and handed him the wooden comb. His fingers, skilled at skinning game and tying complex knots, fumbled clumsily as he attempted to separate her hair into 3 even sections. "You're pulling," she laughed, the sound startling them both with its brightness. "Animals don't complain this much when I handle them," he grumbled, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. After 3 attempts, a lopsided braid hung down her back, far from perfect, but completed with a tenderness that made its imperfections meaningless. In the evenings, as embers glowed in the hearth, Mary would speak of her dreams, not nightmares of being bound in the clearing, but visions of spring festivals where no one was chosen, where rituals celebrated life instead of sacrificing it. John listened, his weathered face softening in the firelight, offering quiet nods where once he might have dismissed such hopes as foolish. "Do you think they'll ever truly change?" she asked one night, her voice small against the howling wind outside. "People or wolves?" John replied, stoking the fire. "Both can learn new ways, given reason enough." The wolf cub had grown, its gray eyes watchful and intelligent. Other wolves still lingered at the forest's edge, drawn by some connection to the girl who had been meant as their sacrifice. Where once John had reached for his knife at their howls, now he watched in wonder as Mary stepped onto the porch, her voice rising in a melody that seemed to speak a language he couldn't comprehend. The wolves would settle, circling at a respectful distance, their earlier hunger transformed into something like reverence. John would bow his head, humbled by this communion that defied everything Elder Brown and the others had taught about beasts and their nature. "They're not so different from us," Mary observed once, returning to the warmth of the cabin. "They protect their own." Laughter, hesitant at first, then freer, began to fill the space between them. It startled John sometimes, this unfamiliar sound in a home that had known only his solitude for so long. The melody of their shared mirth seemed to seep into the very logs of the walls, healing wounds deeper than those visible on skin. The first buds of spring pushed through the soil as Hollow Creek emerged from winter's grip, but the thaw revealed more than just dormant life. The village itself had transformed, its people changed by the long months of reckoning with their own darkness. The ritual that had nearly claimed Mary Johnson's life was officially abandoned, though not without fierce debate that left the community divided. Elder Robert Brown still commanded respect from many, but his authority had diminished. The elder's weathered face showed new lines of defeat as he watched younger families openly question practices once deemed untouchable. In private council meetings, he argued that abandoning tradition would bring ruin, but his words no longer carried the weight of absolute truth. John Smith found himself in an unexpected position. The mountain man wasn't celebrated as a hero, suspicion ran too deep for that. But when he walked through the village, people nodded with a grudging respect that felt heavier than the exile he had endured for years. Some mothers still pulled their children closer when he passed, but others quietly sought his counsel on matters of survival and justice. "The outsider earned his place," Bram Davis admitted one evening at the newly rebuilt granary. The blacksmith's hands were still powerful, but his stance toward John had softened after witnessing how the recluse had risked everything to save both Mary and later the village's food supply. Mary herself moved through Hollow Creek with quiet dignity. The girl who had once been bound as a sacrifice now walked as an equal among those who had condemned her. Her relationship with the wolf cub had evolved, the animal now half-grown, neither fully wild nor tame, but choosing to remain near her. Children watched in fascination rather than fear when Mary passed, whispering that she understood the language of wolves. Healer Jennifer Smith began teaching Mary her craft, finding in the young survivor a natural talent for identifying healing plants, and a gentle touch with the sick. "You have a gift," the healer told her one afternoon as they gathered early spring herbs, one that would have been lost to cruelty. Not everyone embraced the change. Several families, unwilling to abandon generations of belief, moved deeper into the mountains. Others remained but kept their distance, convinced that the village would eventually pay for breaking with ancient ways. Yet as the days lengthened, even the most resistant could see that spring had returned more abundantly than in years past. The wolves kept their distance, and Mary Johnson, once left to die, had become living proof that compassion could forge a path stronger than fear. In the end, what the villagers saw that night, the mountain man cutting a girl's bonds, standing against wolves and elders alike, became the seed of a new legend. Years later, children of Hollow Creek would gather around fires to hear the tale of John Smith and Mary Johnson, their story passed down with reverence rather than fear. The village changed slowly, as all things do in the mountains. Some elders, including Robert Brown, never fully relinquished their grip on tradition, muttering warnings until their final days. But the younger generation looked upon Mary with something approaching awe. The girl who had faced the wolves now taught others to understand rather than fear the wilderness. John remained on the outskirts of community life, more comfortable with silence than celebration. Yet his cabin no longer stood as a symbol of exile, but as a sanctuary where wisdom could be sought. Hunters would stop by, seeking his counsel on tracking game. Parents would bring children struggling with nightmares, knowing his gentle words could ease their fears. "The mountain doesn't demand sacrifice," he would tell them. "It asks for respect." Mary grew into a woman of quiet strength, eventually taking on the role Jennifer Smith once held. As a healer, she combined traditional remedies with the knowledge gained from her time in the wild. The wolf cub, now grown, would sometimes appear at the forest's edge when she gathered herbs, a guardian shadow that reminded everyone of bonds that transcended understanding. Bram Davis, once vocal in his opposition, found himself grudgingly impressed when Mary saved his youngest daughter from fever. His hammer struck with less anger afterward, his voice softer when speaking of tradition. Spring rituals continued in Hollow Creek, but they celebrated renewal rather than appeasement. The vigil became a night of storytelling rather than trembling fear. And if wolves howled in the distance, villagers would nod in acknowledgement rather than cower behind locked doors. Some travelers passing through would hear whispers of the mountain man and the wolf girl, dismissing them as backwoods superstition. But those who stayed longer saw the truth beneath the legend, that courage could break chains of fear, that compassion could heal ancient wounds, and on certain nights, when the moon hung full and bright over the Appalachian Ridge, those with keen eyes might glimpse two figures walking the timberline, the outcast and the survivor, followed by shadows with gleaming eyes, all of them belonging to the mountains in ways no ritual could ever capture.